Now, by the way, Jack, am I allowed to smoke on your? Don't
Of
worry, it's fine.
course,
Okay.
I encourage it. Yeah, yeah,
Well, maybe
yeah,
if you can get when you get sponsors,
yeah.
we do a little bit at
No,
the beginning where it's it's like the 1950s where like Pall Mall. It's like most doctors smoke Pall Mall.
that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. You can do it. You can do whatever you want as
Okay.
long as your pants are on. We're good. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah.
good.
Well, you've lived a pretty interesting life and you have a lot of interesting stories. So I'm excited to get into it. But I
Yeah,
think
it's.
yeah,
Well, I remember when I was about 18, I had one of those youthful, uh, maybe puerile thoughts when late teenage, early 20s. That I thought life should be led like the afterlife when you
yeah,
go to heaven. It's
yeah.
like a dinner party, and you're at a long dinner table, not unlike the Last Supper. And you better try and get as many anecdotes in your lifetime because then you're at the Last Supper. You want to have some nice stories to tell. Uh,
Absolutely.
that was I no longer think of that's life's purpose, but that was when I was 18.
And how did you get into filmmaking? Like, did you start off as a journalist, or is this something that you just randomly started pursuing?
I did. Well, I fell into journalism, print journalism,
Okay.
uh, because a good friend of mine was a journalist. Uh, and I was just thinking about that before because you told me you were going to ask me that question,
Yeah.
and in a way I had the luxury that I don't think today's students or young people have. So in England at the time, university was free. I even had a grant, and all students were allowed to sign on. You could get benefits in the summer. Now, so it's free education. Uh, you could even get money during the school summer holidays, which gave you a lot of time to allow you that luxury of not coming out of college thinking I've got to get a job straight away. I've got to get on the career ladder. Um, but I kind of drifted into print journalism, and I was writing what's called features, non-news basically. And the non-news is important because when my first documentary, I remember the BBC News were like, they sent an email to BBC Documentary saying, Sean Langan's films at best will ruin the reputation of the BBC, and at worst put people's lives at risk. And that's because uh, because I didn't have any news training. When I was suddenly in these what were classically a news location, I'd be doing all my films are set in conflict zones, war, and I've been drawn very much to, foreign policy. But because of my lack of training, when I met the Taliban or American soldiers, I asked what you would always ask, like, what are you smoking? What team do you support? What's life like? Not those classic news questions. And I think with hindsight, that was the best thing I could have ever done because
Mm.
the questions news journalists ask are just completely. You see the 2-minute classic or 60-second on CBS News report from Baghdad or Kiev, but in fact the stuff of life's happening when before that interview and when they're shooting the breeze with the combatants or the civilians. So it was an accidental style because I had no training and I've
Yeah.
stuck with it. A little bit like my camera, I've never really learned how to use a camera. But to answer your question, I was a print journalist, but kind of bored, and I'd been sent to Kashmir by Esquire magazine. I don't even know if that's still running. I mean, American magazine, and I was
Yeah.
doing a kind of
Wow.
what's called a human interest story, which it was. I went with a British family whose son had been kidnapped. He was backpacking in Kashmir. This was 1997, before we'd all heard about Islamic extremism or before the war on terror. And he'd been with 5 other backpackers, including an American, a Norwegian, 5 Westerners backpacking. It seems like an innocent time at that point, and they were
Mm.
kidnapped by Islamist extremists. I was doing a human interest story for 3 weeks with their families who'd gone to Kashmir in search of their children. Unfortunately, they'd all been killed.
Wow.
But what now the BBC gave me a camera and saying, look, can you make a video diary of your time there as a journalist, 3 weeks. And, you know, the truth is 3 weeks isn't enough time to make a film. And, you know, that's how most current affairs TV programs are made, in 3 weeks. But what happened was my girlfriend at the time had dumped me literally the day before I went. And ironically, she dumped me because she liked traveling. And she said, "You're such a boring yuppie." I don't even know if that word yuppie still exists, but I was like, you know, this freelance hack thinking I can't leave London. I've got to be working. I was part of that whole machine thinking I need to earn money. I need to be connected to London. And suddenly the love, you know, I realized she was the love of my life after she dumped me. So I'm in Kashmir. Like, why do I want to go back to London? And what happened was actually the day we were supposed to leave, a man entered the hotel saying to the families, "Look, I know the kidnappers. I can put you in contact with them." But the families had to go back to London. And because I was heartbroken, I said, "Well, I'll stay." So I stayed for, I think, 7 months, which is not how you make professional document. And
Wow.
And the BBC thought I'd gone AWOL, thought I was a bit like Colonel Kurtz. But when I got back, the footage was, it's the best film I've ever done, because I wasn't making a film. I was living this. I was actually living the life. My purpose was to find the kidnappers for these families, and a byproduct, I was making a film. And I think that's the best way to make documentaries. I went with this guy to go and meet the kidnappers, but they were killed. So, but anyway, the BBC loved the footage, and that became a 3-part TV series. And my girlfriend came back to me. We got married. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
She divorced me later when I kept going away.
Okay. And then I guess after that, did you just all of a sudden think like, okay, I'm just going to continue doing this? Did you still have one foot in kind of print journalism, or were you like, this is my path forward?
You know what is interesting, and I think I've got 2 boys now, 2 sons, 21, 20. I remember, I think then I was probably about 30 when I did that documentary. I'd already been a freelance journalist for 10 years. Oh. But I had that something which, you know, we always think, especially when in our 20s, even 30s, we're not quite sure what we want. We have very few people are lucky enough, or maybe it's a curse, not a blessing, to have a vocation. You know, if you're very young, you know you want to study chemical engineering, you're driven. I wasn't like that. I was like most people. Yeah. But when I was in Kashmir in the mountains, one morning I woke up in the middle of nowhere in this village, and I was filming, and I literally woke up consciously happy, and I was like, "Fuck!" Sorry, I asked if I could smoke. I didn't ask if I could swear, but
both are allowed. Yeah.
Okay, I blame that on all the American soldiers I spent a lot of time with. But anyway, I woke up consciously happy, and I realized for the first time in my life, consciously happy, because I'd found my calling in life. It was my life was, which is why I kind of travel. Why I fell in love with it is it's not the normal pressures or stresses with the everyday stuff. You know, I had a very clear purpose and goal in life, that to find these hostages, to make a film, and that clear purpose. But also, I just loved filming because it's that small cameras. You don't have a film crew, so I was literally, you know, I spent months in the mountains with mujahideen, holy warriors, and they forget about the small camera. So you're just living life. But you're living someone else's life in a way. It's like a Tintin. I don't know if you got that in America. That French, Belgian cartoon. Tintin is this character. I read it as a child. He was. It's a cartoon character who goes off on big stories, adventures, and I think that may have planted a seed. But I was, because I discovered what was clearly a vocation for me, a calling. Didn't feel like work. You know, I spent 6 months filming every day. And it was a nice combination of journalism, but also I would take time out to get what's called GVs in TV, general views, B-roll in America. And I love doing that. And so it didn't feel like work. So I was smitten. I literally got the bug.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, I don't
Yeah, I was
I feel
lucky.
like that's yeah. You woke up one morning. And maybe tell me about your experience in Kashmir as well. I mean, you spent a great amount of time. I know it's technically kind of like South Asia, between South Asia and the Middle East, but like you spent a lot of time. You spent most of your career in the Middle East. Was there something about that trip that
Yeah, it
motivated you
was
to keep going?
pivotal. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
pivotal. And it's, I think how life works. I knew nothing about Islam. I'm a classic Londoner.
Yeah.
I've got an Irish father, living in London, Catholic by birth, but
Mhm.
I'd never barely read the Bible.
Yeah.
Uh, Quite secular liberal. Didn't And my interest up until that point, I grew up watching movies about the Cold War. I loved all of that. Loved foreign stuff, foreign news. But Kashmir, which is it's the north of India,
Yeah.
between India and Pakistan, and it's in one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's like Switzerland without the Swiss and tarmac roads. It's the Hindu Kush, the Himalayas. It's one of the most stunning places in the world, and just by just how life works. I knew nothing about it, but that was the beginning of this whole what's called the Islamist the Islamic wave that had started unbeknownst to most people in the West. In
Yeah.
1989, we're looking at the Berlin Wall coming down. The world's focus on, and I that was the beginning of my foreign print journalism. I covered the collapse of communism, and at the time it was called the end of history in DC. Like policy think tanks. A guy wrote
Yeah.
this book, The Triumph of Freedom and Democracy. Little do we know, it was not the end or the triumph of
Yeah.
anything. And at the same time, there was the Middle East were looking at this revolutions in Europe about people coming out of communism, wanting freedom and democracy. We didn't know at the time, but they thought, well, that wave of freedom and democracy would go to the Middle East. It would spread to Egypt, Saudi. Of course, it didn't. And we in the West, we didn't support any freedom, democracy in the Middle East and all the dictators. So I then, just by chance, am in a country that's the beginning of that wave of Al Qaeda, extreme Islam, and in fact, the kidnappers, were one of the early signatories who joined Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was sort of, it was Al Qaeda, but also other groups joined, signed up, swore an allegiance to Osama. So just by accident, I'm doing that story. And then, of course, when I come back, the BBC were like, wow, that's a really good film. And you will hang out these guys with big beards and AK-47s. I mean, it was as simple as this. And they said, why don't you go to this place, Afghanistan, another place we knew very little about. This was 1999 now. I was commissioned, and it was basically, well, you were good hanging out with these guys with big beards and guns. There's this group called the Taliban who are in charge in Afghanistan. So that was my first commission. I went
Wow.
to Afghanistan in literally a year before 9/11. I was there for 2 years on and off. Now, at that point, we knew so little about the world, and this is the danger about the world when you turn your back and once upon a time we've been very focused on Afghanistan when the Soviet Union were there. There's that brilliant movie Charlie Wilson's War. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, great movie.
And at the end of the movie, when we defeat the Soviet Union with the help of our lovely, cuddly Mujahideen allies, we turn the tap off. We turn our back on Afghanistan. Well, I arrived. The Taliban were like this medieval. We'd only heard rumors, and I was the only journalist, the Westerner. I made the first documentary about the Taliban, which was difficult because they banned filming, so I kept getting arrested. But I was in Jalalabad. My hotel was literally a couple of blocks away from Osama bin Laden's house, and there were all the Al Qaeda camps surrounding me. And I remember going into the market, this is like 1999 and 2000. I was there in 2000 filming, and there were lots of Arabs. And I'd asked my fixer, well, who are these guys you're saying hello to? And he said, well, that guy's from Egypt. He's an expert in fertilizer bombs. That guy, he's this, and he's from Islamic Jihad. And it was basically a terrorist campus training.
Wow.
And I remember thinking in 2000, wow, this is bound to come and blow back. These guys aren't sitting here. And there were thousands. I mean, literally thousands.
Wow.
Everywhere you went, you saw them training. And I assumed, well, like we always do, that's why I doubt conspiracy, the whole thing that there were really intelligent people running the world secretly, I wish they were, but not that intelligent.
Yeah.
That I assume the CIA and everyone were all over this because there was no secret. I mean, Osama bin Laden gave a press conference declaring war. There wasn't that 9/11 wasn't a surprise attack in that sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was there, made the film called Tea with the Taliban, and that came out a few months before 9/11. So once 9/11 happened, I was married to that woman who'd left me when I went to Kashmir. We were planning to go to Argentina, but when those planes flew in to the World Trade Center, that was it. Because I'd already been there. I was covering the war on terror then from that point on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to back up for a sec because you mentioned some pretty wild stuff. So, when you were in Afghanistan filming, you were arrested a few times?
Constantly. Yeah, they were quite charming about it. I had a Taliban visa. They were running it.
What did that look like? Walk me through kind of one of your arrests. Like how did that go down, and how did you get out?
At that point, there were no flights into Afghanistan. You had to drive from Pakistan through. Now it was through the Khyber Pass. Now that doesn't mean anything to many Americans, but to the British, I grew up. That was part of our history of empire. Where Winston Churchill was a young soldier. British had been up there. Now, in fact, as you drive through this pass called the Khyber Pass, there are gravestones dotted all over the mountains. And the Taliban would stop so I could pay my respect. It was so sweet of them. And I was like, what respect? And these were the gravestones from 1815, 1790 for English soldiers or Scottish, Irish. Most of them died of dysentery. And they talk about Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. But so that was I drove through and I'd read about it. It was like a Kipling novel,
Yeah.
Of British soldiers up there. In those days, in the 19th century, it was beyond remote. But the Afghans looked the same. They were using the same tactics. And it was like I'd landed on the dark side of the moon. As you drove along these, there were no roads. They were all blown up. Russian tanks still littered the roads. It was really eerie, and there was no light in any of the towns. There was hardly any electricity. The Taliban are great at defeating superpowers, but they're not very good at building roads or stuff like that. And there was on the road there'd be checkpoints, and there'd be film, audio tape, which they confiscated from the locals. Now, this is when I fell in love with Afghanistan. We got stopped by a Taliban checkpoint, and they were threatening to kill me. They always come on really heavy, and they're quite frightening when you come across them because they look like Blackbeard the pirate. I mean, it's like, but then the moment you kind of say, look, calm down, should we have a cup of tea? Which is why I called the film. And they're like, you sit down and have tea. The moment you have tea, it very quickly segues into you're one of our brothers. And I never forget, I was at this checkpoint where there was literally all these smashed cameras, phone, everything, which they confiscated and punished people. It was like fluttering in the sky. I'm there having tea. And they say to me, I asked them, because my fixer, I had a very good fixer. He said, well, look, can Sean start filming? And they're like, yeah, you're our brother now. So they broke their own rules. So I filmed, and people kept stopping and were asking the Taliban, what are you doing with that foreigner? And they would say, we've arrested him for filming, but I was interviewing them. So I loved that place. They were Anyway, so but occasionally I went too far.
Yeah.
I was arrested, thrown out of the country. But I would always just reapply, and somehow the communication wasn't very good. I'd go back to the Taliban. They only had 2 embassies, one in Pakistan, one in UAE, and they would never ask me, why are you reapplying? And I'd go back in, and they would say, but we threw you out. And I'd say, well, you let me back in. So it was a difficult process, but
Whoa, what do you think? I mean, that's really fascinating. Like, what was it about your interactions with them that allowed them to transition from hostile to friendly?
there's a number of things. I had this I mean, I've been blessed. I mean, I think in a parallel life, I would have been killed many times, stepping on a mine that didn't go off. I remember in Iraq, the American soldiers stepping, an American soldier said, don't move. He saw wires coming out from beneath my boot. This is in Fallujah. And what I never forget, this American soldier, whose name I don't think I ever knew, he got down on his knees to check my foot. That man put his face on the ground next to a IED to save me. But it's American soldiers. Just now in Russian-occupied Ukraine, Russian soldiers going in front of me through a minefield. I'm here today because of the kindness of others. And 25 years doing war, my overwhelming memories are of human kindness. So now the Afghans in particular are incredibly, I think, it's part of the culture, both mainly Afghan, but also Islamic, of being good hosts.
Yeah.
But for them, it's not an act. I've seen it in other Arab countries where sometimes you feel it's like, or the English politeness.
It's like a little performative. Yeah.
It's not heartfelt.
Yeah.
But with the Afghans, and I think it's a mountain thing. I found it in Kashmir. Saw it in Idaho in America. There's something about mountain folk, rural folk, that they're incredibly amiable, good companions. Another thing is, bizarrely, they share a kind of similar sense of humor to English. They love Mr. Bean. Fuck
That's
knows
awesome.
why. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
So humor got me. That broke the ice. Having a cup of tea, crack a few jokes, and people who one moment are threatening to kill you, the next moment are putting. I remember I once being held up by some terrorists in the mountains. I used to drive all over Afghanistan doing stories. It was far more dangerous when the Americans liberated it, than when the Taliban were in charge. But I remember a guy who arrested me later on, a day later, was putting himself in front of me when some other guys were threatening to kill me, and he said, "You'd have to shoot." He said to them, "You'd have to shoot me before I let you kill this guy." So it wasn't so much that place. I went there many times over 10, 15 years. It feels more like a love affair. And in fact, my wife did say, the one who got back to me, came back to me after Kashmir, that you spend more time with the Mujahideen. It's like it's like your mistress, and you're having. But it was, I think, anyone who goes to Afghanistan either hates it or has a lifelong love affair with that place, because it's bewitching, but it can bite you. It can kind of suck you in as well.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. It's crazy.
That's what my therapist said, but that's why I didn't go back.
It's crazy because, I mean, it's crazy because what you're talking about is like going to some place that has been, we've been at war with, and we demonize. And I'm actually, like, I'm curious, what was the, at least when it might have changed, but like when you first went there, I don't know a ton about the Taliban, but what is the actual intention of the Taliban? What is their motivation? What unites them? What is their political movement about?
Yeah. Oof. I mean, I never forget to ask that question. I mean, I'll give you I was once at a meeting in London. It was with military, intelligence. It was a sort of, and they invited a couple of journalists. And so it was basically the lead experts on Afghanistan from Britain. But I've been to equivalent in DC, Taliban experts, where you have military, State Department, the intelligence communities, various. And I remember both the Americans and the British, which is something about our modern world. So they would stand up. This one in London, it was like a British commander, soldier, who'd been in charge of, say, a district in Afghanistan, Helmand province, where the British were, or the Americans in Kandahar province or something. And they'd get up, and the West has this incredible ability with our technology to know what. I was shocked how much they knew about the Taliban in Afghanistan. So they would say, okay, each person could be from the British Security Intelligence Service or the military or the Foreign Office, like the State Department, would get up and say, right, we know who all the Taliban leaders are in our area, the terrorists. They had their phone numbers. They knew how many men they got, where the drugs were coming in. They had, to me, what I thought was an incredible picture, which are online social media platforms. You know, this whole thing about data. We're data obsessed, and also what's the other one they have where they love the American military, love having, I forgot the name, where they sort of computer where they have everything on graphics. And they give talks. They're always having data, graphics. Anyway, at the end of each speech, they would end by saying, "We don't get the end. We don't understand it." They had every Taliban's phone number. They knew where they could find their satellite positions. And I thought, wow, they could defeat these guys in seconds. They know where they live. Yeah. But at the end of it, it was like, we don't get it. We don't understand it. And somehow I think, which is one of the motivations in my work traveling, we're in this world where we know so much about the world, people, but there's still such great misunderstanding. You see it everywhere in the Middle East now with Gaza, Palestine, and Israel. It's perhaps the first time in the history of the world where our ability, with data and just surveillance, that we can know everything. And it's that fear that governments know too much. But at the same time, they got these massive blinds, this lack of understanding. So with the Taliban, they are very unstructured. I remember when I was there that they're quite mercurial, and they sort of seem to come together like mercury. And as far as there's no, it's not like the old communist things where things were written down, other regimes or in the West. There's no constitutions. They've got the Quran. Yeah. That's not a guide, and they've got beliefs, but it's quite so. To put your finger on it, it's very difficult. What I would see, which is obvious, I knew very quickly after we went in. When I say we, the West, that war, we were losing that war. It was what as President Obama called it. It was a good war, unlike the one in Iraq. America had been attacked from bases from the Al Qaeda and Taliban supported them in Afghanistan. So the war made sense. It was, if ever there's a reason to fight a war, America and the West had it. But we never understood Afghanistan or the Afghans. The Taliban are mainly Pashtun. It's from the south of Afghanistan. There's two really big main divides. Pashtun, which are really, they're kind of tough, hard, mainly literate country guys, and the Pashtun tribes and Dari, which are Persian speaking, like Iran. So there's a tribal thing, a cultural thing, but they're kind of, I don't think they've got a sort of strict ideology. The one thing about the Afghans, a bit like Lebanese traditionally, where they were very flexible, and that's why I was able to operate there for 20 years. The Afghans are great travelers. When the Afghans come to Britain as immigrants, they adapt incredibly quickly, and there's Afghans in America. So they're not strict extremists as that the cliche is, which you do find with the Gulf Arab Al Qaeda. Yeah. And now, in fact, one thing I remember very strongly, the Afghans never got on with the Arab Al-Qaeda fighters on a personal level. And I was with Taliban before the Americans invaded and Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban were always saying, "Oh, those bloody Arabs," and so because they found that Al-Qaeda fundamentalism too strict, too constricting for the Afghan. But at the same time, yes, now the Taliban are running Afghanistan, and that's I think we've taken our focus, our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, and that's history has proved that to be very dangerous.
Yeah. And how do you compare that to, because you spend a lot of time in both countries, and both, as you just pointed out, like the more fundamentalist militant groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS have a very different motivation than the Taliban. When you were in Kashmir before 9/11, what did you identify as the motivation for Al Qaeda and the militant groups that you were kind of interacting with?
Well, again, Kashmir is famous as Afghanistan. Actually, the two are quite linked. Their main strain of Islam pre 9/11 and pre the spread of Al Qaeda, which I'll briefly try and explain, was the main strain of Islam in Kashmir and Afghanistan was Sufi Islam. Now, Sufi would be condemned, seen as haram by Al Qaeda, the extreme Salafists. And I explain these phrases, but basically, Kashmir, that Sufi is this lovely strain of Islam, which was really predominant when. Which is funny because Al Qaeda looked back at the days when Islam was all powerful not only in the Middle East but in Spain and parts of Europe, in the 1600s. Sufi, there's a respect for the spiritual side of Islam, music, poetry, all the things that the extremists today hate. And that was when Islam had its empire. That aspect was very strong, and that strain still existed in Kashmir. Now, ironically, what happened as the wars from over this period, last 20 years, have gone on, Al Qaeda, that form of Islam, which is called Salafi, which is, i.e., you pray 5 times a day like Muhammad did, peace be on him. You sort of, and you wear your clothes. You have to. The Taliban became obsessed by the length of your beard, how you do things. Now that's from India actually, but a lot of this was exported. Now, here's the thing: I won't go into all the details, but Saudi Arabia, considered our main ally in the Middle East, for 30 years was exporting. And when I say exporting, that's because Saudi Arabia would build mosques in any country, in London, Pakistan, but when they gave money for these mosques, it was on the agreement that they would be that Saudi style of Islam, the Salafi, which is very strict, doesn't like the music, the poetry, and they exported that, and Al Qaeda then exported that, and it was foreign. They talk about Western colonialism and that we export our beliefs, whereas in fact the Islam exported around the Middle East by these fighters was funded by Saudi petrodollars. So that's what I witnessed really, and it's alien to many of the cultures where it's now in the countries. Sorry, it sounds like a lecture.
No, it's very interesting, and I mean, I think religious fundamentalism is very fascinating. We've been dealing with it for a long time, and I think we're going to continue dealing with it into the future. So I'm curious. I mean, before we get into some other topics,
on that though, it's so when you travel when we're sitting in our New York or London, and you go abroad, what you notice first are the differences. So if you go to Japan, we immediately see these. We're drawn to what's different, and so in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, of course, one of the things we notice is this Islamic culture or the Islamic politics. But very quickly, when you get because you're not there every day talking about religion or Islam.
Yeah.
The moment you get below the surface, you start to see the commonality and the common humanity.
Of course. Yeah.
I'll give you an example when you talk about religious fundamentalism. I was in Tehran on a demonstration, and they're all shouting "Magba America," which means death to America.
Yeah.
We hate America. Okay,
Yeah.
they're shouting, burning American flags. I'm filming and I'm doing my typical, and I say, hang on, I'm not American, because they're shouting at the camera, death to America.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not American. And
Yeah.
I'll never forget, this guy went, oh God, I'm so sorry. Didn't mean to upset you. And then he went, Magpie England. He started going, death to
No
England. I'm
way.
like, oh, that's very sweet. I'm glad you. But I remember getting into a cab in Tehran, and there was a cab driver had a little American flag, a sticker beneath the steering wheel, and hanging from his wing mirror a little Mickey Mouse. You go everywhere in Tehran, there's a huge love for American culture, and that's today. And Iran, they're considered. So I think that there's a danger of focusing on the religious thing, but it's one. You soon, when you're there and you're immersing yourself, it shouldn't be something to divide anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I'm asking the question because I'm just curious. People in the media, in the way that we understand these groups is, one of the explanations is, well, it's about the actual religion. Some people agree with that, some people don't. Other people say, well, it's actually just a bunch of kind of disadvantaged youth that are, finding basically opportunity, or you're putting their kind of energy into something, and you
Yeah,
have basically a bunch of people that are exploiting them. That's another explanation. So I'm curious. I'm trying to understand it from your perspective, somebody that's
yeah.
been there. Like, what do you see when you saw
Well,
these movements growing? Yeah.
yeah, see, and I did lots of strains, and it's quite a complicated one. But I try and
Yeah.
sketch out what some of the things I saw. Well, statistically, actually, Al Qaeda and a lot of the groups, the idea of being made up of disadvantaged youth. No, in fact, Al Qaeda did very well when as early a lot of the groups in the Middle East, engineers, graduates were drawn to it. And in fact, say with this war in Syria, a lot of many thousands of Westerners who went, many British went to fight for ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
They would, I interviewed quite a few British guys who came from good parts of London. Uh, and I remember there's some counterintuitive things. So there was a number of young British Muslim girls, very young, 16, 15, being drawn to go to Syria. And in fact, hundreds of British young women went.
Wow.
I became slowly aware and then found out, and it was confirmed by these girls, one of the appeals, which is never written about or talked about when you talk about why are young Westerners, including some Americans and Canadians who went to Syria to fight with ISIS. Well, if you're a young British Muslim girl whose father, immigrant father, maybe from Bangladesh or Sudan or Egypt, well, they're very strict. So if you're a young girl in London, your brother's given freedom to hang out, drink, go off, but you're kept at home by the dad. And ISIS videos were brilliantly pitched. It was like the 60s. You look at San Francisco of long-haired, good-looking hippies. Well, the ISIS videos were these very sexy young guys with long hair. They look like Che Guevara. There was one of the appeals that's never been written about if you were a young, cosseted girl growing up in London with a very conservative, strict father, was the freedom that ISIS offered in Syria. Now I haven't. There's no data on that.
Yeah.
But I met young girls who were no longer young girls. They were like 20 in refugee camps who were like, yeah, this was freedom. For many of the young British, predominantly Muslims, their parents, they grew up as Muslim. They might have had foreign, Arab fathers from various Muslim countries. This is a big thing driven around the world. Now, I mentioned how my first gig as a journalist was covering the collapse of communism. That was in the end. The Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. It's ancient history now, but at that point in 1990, there was only one superpower left, America, and it was considered the triumph of freedom and democracy. And I feel we've thrown that away. The West at that point, having lived in a bipolar world of two superpowers competing, suddenly the freedom and democracy had triumphed. And how we look back, how we wasted that chance, because there wasn't a country in the world at that point who was opposed to America. There were no Osama bin Laden's, Putin's, Iranians calling for the overthrow of America. And I've really witnessed, just as a small a bystander, it's like a slow train crash happening in slow motion, how the goodwill towards the West has been dissipated. And so I remember being outside Abu Ghraib prison, where we were torturing people. Now, the weird thing is, that story, it finally broke in 2004. Photographs appeared, but everyone in Iraq knew that story, because I remember driving past that prison. I'd go from Baghdad to Fallujah, and these where the insurgency really was strong against the Americans. But every day, the queues outside, the lines of people waiting to see loved ones in Abu Ghraib just grew. So after a year, there was hundreds, thousands of people waiting to see their. And I stopped the car one day, and wow, the stories were old grannies telling me, my son's been, he did nothing. And then they were like, they're being raped, tortured. Now, here was the thing about me as a Westerner. I found it hard to believe these stories. This is before it broke in the news. And a young woman, a very beautiful young Iraqi woman who was translating for the Americans, she came up to me out of the crowd and said, and she showed me her ID that she worked for the Americans. She said, I've seen it with my own eyes. They're sexual, psychological torture, physical torture. They're piling bodies up. The BBC saw the interview and went, wow, we can't broadcast this because you haven't verified it. And I never forget that. So I knew about Abu Ghraib, and then it was 8 months later when American soldiers somehow leaked the photos to CBS and other people. Now, going back to answer your question, that sense of injustice was a huge recruitment tool, as is Gaza. So many of the young British Muslims went to Syria because they saw the hypocrisy. Whether, we talk about human rights. Now, this is old. We should know this now, but that was a great recruitment. We parading prisoners in Guantanamo in orange boiler suits. Well, my friend, I had an American friend, James Foley, who was paraded in an orange boiler suit by ISIS before they beheaded him. So we created a lot of that, which Al-Qaeda, the whole plan for Al-Qaeda was they wanted America to come into Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq, literally, we handed Al-Qaeda and his kind of allies a gift on a plate, because that was the best recruitment for anyone wanting to fight America. So yeah, I witnessed all of that.
Interesting. Yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like one of the threads behind Al Qaeda and ISIS is this desire. The abuse that the United States has and the Western world, I guess, has hit the Muslim world with, and there's this desire. They feel incredibly abused, and they want the United States to essentially repent for what it's done to them.
I think the danger is, though, you see, people get very upset, rightly, and American soldiers or people on the. I don't feel myself left or right.
Yeah.
I've got so many. I would be considered today's world. We're jumping here, but we're now in this modern world we live in.
Yeah.
Which is very different to when I started. That I used to go off to war zones and places where we would see extremism.
Yeah.
And I used to love coming back to London after being in really dangerous, hostile environments. And you arrive in London and you get a black taxi, one of the London cabs, black cabs they're called, and I would come across Westminster Bridge and I would see Big Ben, and I always felt, God, it's lovely coming back to London or New York, because these are the land of reason and understand, where we get compromised. And ironically, over the course of my time going abroad, we're no longer this oasis of rational compromise. Now, liberal are using in the traditional sense, which was by definition, we in the West are all considered liberal democracies. Now, liberal gets spat out as a term like commie, and so we've become more the extremism, or I would use the word intolerance, which used to be over there, I now find here. But so I only said that because when you make statements, uh, uh, people then accuse you of being a liberal or pro the Taliban, nothing like that. And I don't like people. There's no justification for ISIS. Now, they were defeated not by anything we did, but they were defeated by their own horrific extremism that the locals in Syria, Iraq found them was their extremism was, and their intolerance and brutality was so extreme, they had no support. And they were so violent to the Muslims in Syria, population in Iraq. That's what defeated ISIS. They defeated themselves. And there's no, but so the people running these terrorist organizations, they're not doing it because they have any sense of injustice. There's, at the top, the people who are leading certain groups they're better off, that's why we send in our special forces to slot them, to kill them. So, but I'm not talking about them. That's not so they're not, they don't need anything. There's nothing America's done to justify or give them reason. They're going to do that. But what they use is the average Joe who joined. We gave them too many examples of our hypocrisy. And so that we did act as a recruitment sergeant for many of these organizations. But now, one thing I would say, though, after all my time abroad, with many militant groups and other armies, I used to wait. I remember I was, you haven't asked me, but I was kidnapped by the Taliban. But I remember waking up in my cell after being to Abu Ghraib, after seeing us invade Iraq. But I woke up in my cell where every morning, every day, I'm surrounded by intolerance and I was being interrogated. But I woke up and I could actually hear the Taliban did let me have a radio. So I would listen to the World Service, BBC. And it's a beautiful voice, the BBC World Service, of this English voice of tea and tolerance. But at the time, it was 2008 when I was kidnapped, and Barack Obama was running for president. And I must say, though, his speech is coming. I was in a cell in the mountains in Hindu Kush, where literally I've been watching beheading videos. I was in a dark cell, and that voice of hope, it was like the beacon on the hill, which is what America represents, was so powerful, that oratory. And I remember, I thank God that if there's any country that if we're gonna be living under the heel of any country, I'd rather it be America than all the other regimes out there. So one thing I always think it's important to bear in mind, it's a very lovely thing of the West. With young protesters on American campuses or British, we're very hard on our own society, as we should be. But if you compare life for most people in America to those in China, who is this surveillance police state, or in Egypt, Pakistan, I thank God that I was born in the West. And if you're going to have a superpower at the moment, I can't think of another replacement, unless the Swedes or the Danes suddenly became number one. I could live under them.
There's a lot of good stuff there. I mean, I think I also have lived abroad and traveled a lot, and I think that kind of perspective opens your eyes to the opportunities that you are given living in the West, and
Yeah,
also opens your eyes to I mean, freedom of speech and critical thinking are a tool to make this country freer and stronger. So like that's the point of protest. You're not. I mean,
but I feel
you're
that I don't know about
yeah
you, Jeff, but I mean,
yeah
I'm older than you. I
yeah
feel that uh, we can't take that for granted anymore. Or you know,
yeah
and I feel it's. I don't want to use the word attack, but it is being undermined, and I feel it's under attack here now, and in the West, the what now I'm playing with the term uh, safe. I suppose they call it a safe space because I know
yeah
that's used. But no, what the West was a safe space for people didn't fall out over arguments, political arguments. When I was young, I had friends from across the spectrum, and in fact, I still do. But I realize I'm quite rare,
hmm
and my spectrum is very wide, given my
yeah
job.
yeah
So I've got. I mean, here's the thing: is a European originally, most Europeans would go East Coast or West Coast. If they go to America, and I worked in the media, so I knew people in New York or LA. But going to Iraq, Afghanistan was like traveling through the heartland of America because all the soldiers I would meet in different bases would be from the heartland,
yeah
Texas, Florida, wherever. But I got friends now who'd be considered, rednecks or
hmm
Trump behavior. But, they were more liberal than most of my TV bosses in New York, I can tell you that. And, but, I got friends who were jihadis. But I've recently, I've just come back from Russian occupied Ukraine, and I experienced something I'd never experienced before. I was filming on the Russian side,
yeah
and it turns out, well, I went. There's the reason why I went. It's it's the most one-sided coverage of any war I've seen in 30 years. Uh, all the Western media are on the Ukrainian sides of the front line. They're all based in Kiev, and at the beginning of the war, we're talking thousands. And there were practically none, apart from pro-Russian propagandists, YouTubers, on the Russian side. Now, 30 years ago, all journalists were like, "Yeah, we're going both sides." We want, CNN interviewed Osama bin Laden.
yeah
Uh, but when I was proposing that, and when I came back and the film aired on British TV, there were howls of complaint. How dare you film on that side? We shouldn't be telling this side of the story, i.e., the other side. Now that's new to me, and there were protests. All of this fueled online, so there were
yeah
complaints
for sure
online by people who hadn't seen the film. That's the other thing. And what I noticed in the Ukraine-Russia war has been amplified times 10 in Gaza, the Israel-Gaza conflict, is that we now in the West take sides very quickly. We don't want to hear the other side's story, don't want to understand. And I think, I hate to say it, but this is being fueled and amplified and distorted by online platforms. I don't like
social
using
media
the word,
platforms.
yeah, and
Yeah
I don't like using the word media because
yeah
they talk about legacy media.
yeah yeah
I mean, fuck them is what I'm saying, because the
yeah
irony about they call themselves online media, when when they were set up, they made sure they weren't called media because they didn't want to have the responsibilities of media. So
yeah
YouTube, Google, they're not media because we're not broadcasters. They argued we're not publishers. Same with Twitter. We are platforms,
yeah
which allows them to say whatever. Uh, but I've now found that so I've never had so much flack for just going on the other side. And to me, the reason why I got into journalism, it's one of my guiding lights, is to
yeah
understand the other side's point of view. Not because I like them or agree, but that's how you end wars, if you understand what the enemy wants.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're living in interesting times, and uh, I seem to kind of recognize this strain of polarization probably after 2016. It seems like and like the legacy media when Trump was elected, there every single article was all of a sudden about Trump, and it distorted and kind of destroyed, unfortunately, like legacy media, the CNN and the New York Times, who at one point in time were bastions of free speech.
Yeah,
A lot of the media became like fear porn. Like it attracts all these
It
people.
became
Oh,
what? Sorry, fear.
fear porn.
Oh,
Like
fear porn. That's a good one. I
yeah,
haven't heard of that.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Like they're grabbing your attention with these like really catchy, scary titles. Everybody's all wound up and anxious about Trump or some sort of attack in some other part of the world. The quality of it polarizes people. And
So you're saying
yeah,
that of the New York Times, not online media. You're
I,
talking about CNN. Yeah, I
I'm saying,
agree. I mean,
yeah. I'm saying, yeah. I mean that definitely happened, and then now, I first saw it there in like the late teens, and then now, I mean, social media has played a. I mean, after October 7th attacks, I read an article that was kind of analyzing the content on TikTok, and
yes.
there was this video that was in circulation that was basically an Osama bin Laden sympathy video where like tens of millions of people in the United States and England and the West were watching and sharing this video that was essentially saying Osama bin Laden was right, Hamas is justified in their actions against Israel, and so we have to, and so that's obviously ridiculous and absurd. And the way that the algorithms work on these social media or platforms, the way that they work, I think, is not fully understood. But a lot of it has to do with outrage, and
Well,
so they were shared and
but
incredibly scary.
I mean, you know
Yeah,
more about that than me. But isn't that the algorithms of all these social media are? They've realised, or it's not. It was well known for many years that they didn't have the tools that we have. Our impulse, fear porn.
yeah,
We react to strong things. It's
exactly.
not necessarily what we like, but it gets it's. But
They're
I
using,
don't
yeah,
think the new. I mean, I would sort of draw back a bit. That I
yeah,
think I'm saddened by what I've seen. Now,
yeah,
I should say this first. I looked up to, because so being a war journalist, it's actually a very small number of people who do that in the world. It's a traveling band because it costs so much money, which is why you're not seeing online media sending reporters out, because it costs a fortune going to war zones. But I knew all the New York Times, CNN, CBS correspondents traveling around, and you meet them in these war zones, and they're I take my hat off. They're some of the best journalists I've seen, much better than me. But collectively, uh, I am a little bit depressed. We if you look at journalism from the 1960s, the journalists in America covering Vietnam or Watergate, the quality it certainly has not gone up since then.
yeah,
And CNN now seems to me it's just talking heads. It's just sitting in studios. Now, I get it why there's this anger amongst Trump supporters, but also the soldiers I met up in Afghanistan, Iraq. The CNN now, they're not. They started off, they were on the ground. I mean,
yeah,
all I see now in when I turn on the TV, CNN, they're in a studio. They're like a mirror to Fox and MSNBC are,
for sure.
and it's gone out the window now. They, I think, though, were the John the Baptist to online media's Jesus, where
Mm.
so we too maybe we blame online media too much, but you look at Fox and even CNN and MSNBC, they're just all
Yeah,
blowing
100%.
smoke. Yeah, opinions, and we know
Yeah,
what but where where I think it's a whole new level now that people are reacting to what they see on Twitter or X, YouTube, TikTok, where here's the thing. I look at what I just had to do for what's so-called legacy media. I get sent to Russian-occupied Ukraine, and it's made for British public broadcaster ITV, and there was some German broadcaster co-producer. Well, and I developed worked at the BBC. There's a strict code you've got to follow as a journalist before you can broadcast. You've got to check your facts. If I was interviewing people in the field, especially on sensitive subject like the war in Ukraine, and I was with Russians, this is kind of answering your question about Hamas and the war in Gaza, Israel. Everything I interviewed, I was being back home in London. My executives would be like, "Hang on, who is this unit? Do you trust what they've said? How do you know you weren't being set up?" And I was being put through the mill, but gladly so. So because they were worried that there would be disinformation, the Russians might be manipulating me.
Yeah.
Now I've got my 30 years of training in war zones, so I know if the soldier, you get a sense, has this been set up. But no one trusted me. We checked everything. Experts checked. And it goes out on TV. Well, it took 6 months to check and make everything. Now people are putting whatever, and they're faking it, either using deep fake or saying this right. Elon Musk saying that civil wars are erupting in England. There isn't a civil war here. And we had what's called football hooligans. Every Saturday you would see riots in streets in London, and you take a snapshot and someone says civil war.
Yeah.
Well, so this where I get very angry about this fucking, they call fake news. Well, that's the fake news came from people and legacy media. Well, it might be biased, but oh my God, I spent 6 months being told, you check those facts, we don't broadcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try that. I get angry on that one.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and to kind of like finish off on this point, and to tie it into kind of your films, where I was getting at is one of the, I mean, the kind of degradation and decreasing quality of these institutions which we once revered, the New York Times, CNN. It seems like over time you can see that the staff and the leadership of these organizations became increasingly ideological. You're picking a side. And you see this, and this is what we're seeing right now. People are picking sides. You're in camp A or camp B, and it's really scary. Like, I don't know if this is real, but I once heard somebody say, and for better or for worse, like the West becoming more secular, with the West becoming more secular and people, not as religious, that kind of where does the religion go? Where does the ideology go? And it's kind of been transformed into social causes. It seems like people are like feverishly opposed to certain ideas and pick a camp and are very, what I would say, ideological. You hear, it's interesting, like right now, especially with social media, but right now you hear like, and I guess at the height of the culture wars, you heard a lot of people anecdotally repeating the same kind of arguments, and there wasn't a lot of room for kind of nuanced individualistic thought. And I had a bit of an aha moment when I was watching the movie that or the documentary you just mentioned, The Other Side, where you're covering the war in Ukraine and Russia, on the Russian side. And because one of I think, like, from my perspective, I was like, I really enjoyed that perspective because I got to see, and you hear about this is kind of like a trope in Russian history, but the dogmatic views that the people hold, all of this kind of ideological bullshit that their government and propaganda that their government spews on them, they repeat. So you hear a lot of the same, the Russians were saying, we're fighting Nazis. This is something that is not, from my research, not really a big part of the actual meat of the reason that Ukraine and Russia are fighting, but it was an excuse that the Russian soldiers were using consistently. And it reminded me a lot of kind of just my interactions with people in the political sphere in the United States today. Like, people are
but
using these same kind of arguments. Yeah.
Sorry to cut in there. The Russians who would talk this thing about we're fighting Nazis, they weren't that invested in that. They weren't heartfelt. Whereas young people in the West now, one thing I found myself, there seems to be this, as you were saying, this really emotional intensity and anger, which I found increasingly alien to me. So here's a weird thing. I remember coming back from, I think it was Syria. Now, I'd been interviewing ISIS guys 3 ISIS fighters who kidnapped and beheaded my friend.
These are the Beatles.
The
British
ISIS
ISIS
Beatles.
soldiers?
They were called.
Yeah.
This cell were called. They were called the Beatles because by the hostages because there were 4 of them and they were from Britain.
Yeah.
Because the hostages could only hear the English accent, so they were. Yeah, it's terrible that they took that name. But anyway, so I was interviewing 2 of these guys who tortured and killed my friend Jim Foley, and I got back to England, and then I went to some literary festival where it's a modern thing, and there were these a discussion between feminists and trans. Now, and it was a festival, so you were like intense camping, and I was giving a talk about Syria. But anyway, and I was with my 2 children who were about 7 at the time, and this tent near me were these young feminists who were giving a talk, and suddenly there was this shouting because they'd met the trans people who were they were going to be debating with, and my God, they were having a fight, like a really like a street fight you think is going to kick off.
Wow.
And I've just come from a place of such violence and being immersed,
Yeah.
and all I'm thinking is, wow, it's so nice to be in England. Look at this field. Now, what struck me was these young feminists and young trans lobby was they were both so Western. You know, I'd come from Syria, and here were young people. We were in a field, you know, because there was music, there was raves. It was like a kind of mixture.
Nice.
And so, from me back now being an outsider, I spent so long on the road in these other places where there is real intolerance and people are being massacred and murdered and people are dying, that I couldn't see the difference between these 2 camps, the trans and the feminist, because to me, one, because I'm like, oh, they were these lovely young student types, but they were arguing about things. I was like, well, it's great, you know, here we are in a field, you've got the freedom to be arguing over trans or feminists. Both would have been beheaded by ISIS.
Yeah.
But also I intervened because they were getting quite verbally violent and they were scaring my kids. So I was like, hey, why are you arguing so much? Anyway, they were really intolerant to me I felt maybe it's because I was like the white liberal male or I was man, but then I said, hey, no, I just want to understand. But when I told them I'd just been in Syria interviewing 2 guys who tortured 23 Westerners, including this lovely young woman, Kayla. I'm just remembering her name because this was a young American woman. Like many of the people we're talking about in the West, you talk about culture wars, she would be very active in the world. And she went off to Syria because she'd been so moved by the suffering out there. Kayla Muller. And she was kidnapped by ISIS and actually raped by the head of ISIS. So when you go back and talk about Islamic, is it religion? Well, the head of ISIS, who set himself up as some religious figure, was raping this young Western woman, this American, who showed great courage. And I just met her kidnappers, and I know they tortured her. And then I explained to these young girls, they were like 20-year-old feminists and the trans, that, wow, you know, I've just been immersed in this horrible world where these terrorists had been torturing young women. You 2, and I'm looking at them, you have so much more in common than the differences. And then when I said I'd met the people who beheaded my friend, all their passion and anger with each other dissipated. And we sat around the campfire because in a way, I think there's something in the West, we've become this inward looking. You know, it's interesting with the recent protests on campuses about Gaza. What I think has electrified young people in the West is this is something of far bigger cause and people are really being killed and dying. It's kind of reinvigorated young people in the West who for the last 10 years have been fighting each other over what look like, now this maybe sound insulting, quite minor differences, because the feminists and trans are on the same spectrum politically, and they like culturally the same things, music or whatever. The similarities would be more similarities than differences, and yet somehow the arguments in these culture wars over small insignificant differences, and I say insignificant when you're talking about 2 minutes later someone's going to cut your head off. You know, when one of the greatest lessons about my kidnap, it was like the greatest lesson in life. I wouldn't want to have it again. I'd rather shoot myself. But I was told I was going to be executed. And you can look back on life and you see the world in this lovely new, with this clarity. And having experienced that near death when I was going to have my head cut off, I come back increasingly in the West, and I just don't get these rivalries and this fighting, even between Trump and Democrat types. You know, it's like I just see much more similarities and the underlying humanity. But it seems to have been these things seem to be blown out of all proportion. And I don't mean to say that for someone who's suffered or some young trans person who feels there's an injustice and they're, or the Me Too or anything like that. But it's a kind of surreal experience for me, having lived on the edge and surrounded by real shocking suffering. You know, in Ukraine, the death rates are staggering. You know, I was walking through fields where the Second World War, you know, millions had died. I'm walking through the same fields, and they've been destroyed by shelling, and it looks like the First World War, Passchendaele or the Somme, and there are just dead bodies everywhere. And so when I come back from that, and people are hating each other, seemingly hate, but filled with anger, I don't get it.
It's very surreal. It's very surreal. Yeah, we're fighting over these small little differences.
But they tend to. His history's shown though that those things go away very quickly when there's an outside existential threat, and suddenly people who are at each other's throats will realize they're one people, one. You know,
absolutely.
I've seen that, and that's the loveliest thing about my life's experiences. The innocence of humanity, that bond, it never dies, and it comes back very quickly. You know, so I have hope, and I'm smiling because, you know, I've had an amazing life, and yet spent half of it in places considered the worst places in the world.
Let me ask you some questions about that. I mean, you've spent a lot of a large portion of your life in war zones, covering wars. I don't know, how do you give me some wisdom, Sean? Like, what if you
wow.
How do you make sense of humanity on one side? On one side, we have this perpetual inclination to destroy one another, but at the same time, as you're saying, I mean, you of all people have been arrested and befriended people that, you know, supposedly are enemies and hate you. Like, there is infinite humanity in the human experience, but there is also the other side of that coin is we are perpetually destroying one another. Like, how do you make sense of this?
Well, I think one of the great deep pleasures of really traveling and trying to see other cultures, other peoples is if you're not going to make sense of it. There are no easy answers. It's the rich fabric of our world and life is that it's this infinite stuff to understand. But at the same time, well, there was a great little thing which came to mind when I was kidnapped. And so when you're a war journalist, you spend a lot of time in airports waiting to get on planes. So you buy the books at the airport. You know, everyone buys books at the airport. My choice of book at airports was those soldiers' tales, special forces writing about their time of, you know, in war zones. And I remember reading a book by a British special forces soldier who'd been tortured, and he was talking about, and this is an FBI thing. They teach this to soldiers or special forces. So it's much harder. It's much harder to kill a fellow human being than a label. So they teach people who are likely to be kidnapped. The first thing you got to do is impress upon your captures your humanity, that you are like them, because it's much easier to kill a title, a label, you know. Now, so when you say there's this propensity to kill each other and to fight and to hate, well, in fact, that's what, going back to the social media, it's a lot easier to get angry and hate not people, these labels, the other side, the
On a
other
screen.
feminist,
Yeah.
trans, Jews, Muslims, Hamas,
Yeah.
because those are all labels. And Fox and CNN scream at each other the hatred, but actually, when you're face to face, so I'd read somewhere to and now the Taliban, and I was held in this home this run by these families. So the Taliban were in the bases; they would come and go. But I was in a family house with 10. It was like a compound. There'd be like 7 men and their multiple wives and children, who I never saw, but I would hear. But I noticed when the Taliban put me in, the men who'd come in, it was like a movie. They'd kick open the door, throw the tray of food on the floor, because they saw me not as a human being, but as what the Taliban told them. I was a non-believer. I was a foreign spy. And, you know, I was all the labels they hated. And over time, and I remember having read, it's much harder to kill a fellow human being. So I was very careful. Luckily, I knew about the culture. How you don't get in someone's face and you're polite, but you don't beg. But I slowly, every day, made a real effort. I would get up, greet them in the Islamic way. That they started, and I would try and impress, sounds ridiculous, my humanity on them. Talk about your children, and it fucking worked. You know, they start to see me as a human being. And then there was this moment, a real turning point. But I mentioned that because the differences get blown out of all proportion, I think. But once you start seeing people, which is why it's so important to understand the other side, people you disagree with more, that's more important to understand those you hate than your allies and friends, because that's where the struggle comes. And the moment you see each other as people, now it's much harder to hate, and you start to see the commonalities and of course they're vast. And it sounds like I'm like your granny saying, look, eat your vegetables because there are people starving in the third world. But you know, I spent so much time with people who, these would be real redneck soldiers who love Trump, hated Hillary, hate New York, hate the media, you know, the liberals, they spit on us. Those guys were the kindest, humane, most liberal guys I've met, some of them, more than my New York boss who talks about, or the, you know, you talk about this New York Times, they'll stab you in the back quicker than anyone. But, you know, and the same with so-called terrorists. But I remember, so if you look in the world and you give people the benefit of the opportunity, you know, see what they're like first, a lot of these differences and the hatred soon really goes away very quickly. During my kidnap, the real turning point. So over the weeks, they started to realize, you know, they used to hang out like me. And there's this real interest in the West. They wanted to know about London, New York. But the turning point was when the Taliban came in. And I was being interrogated, and the commander was there with 2 guys with their faces covered in black shawls, and they were asking me questions, and they asked me the questions of suddenly, you know, I was asking whatever they want to know. I haven't got any secrets. But they suddenly said, what's the name of your children? And all the family, the men with their guns, were watching and be told I was this unbeliever and evil spy. And I suddenly found that I couldn't give them the names of my children because that innocence I didn't want to bring into that world of that dark cell I was in. And I was holding on to that innocence to keep me strong. So I had 2 photos of my children who were then 3 and 4. 3 and 5 I hid them in the boots of my shoe, and every night I would just look at, because the Taliban had taken everything, but I would look at my children for 1 minute to give me strength to continue. If I looked at them for longer than 1 minute, it would break me, because I would think, I'm going to cause some suffering if I die. So I couldn't give my name, and I said to the Taliban, I said, look, I'm really sorry. I understood the Taliban Afghan culture, but you mustn't confront or make them lose face. So I wasn't combative. I said, look, I'm really sorry. I can't give you the names of my children. I wouldn't ask an Afghan Pashtun the name of his wife, And they were like, no, you got to tell us, we've been ordered. And I said, and I was very English. I said, I'm terribly sorry. I'd love to, but I can't. He said, well, we're going to have to shoot you. And he ordered, so I've now got a gun to my head. And I just couldn't, I was very calm, but I said, I'm so sorry, I can't give you the names. And of course, they put the gun to my fixer's head and said, well, give us the names of your children or we're killing you. So I started crying. And I said, okay. And this was a piece of luck. I named my children, but I said, well, my oldest son is Luke. And my youngest son is called Gabriel. And tomorrow he's 4 and I always get upset. He'll be wondering why his dad hasn't called to say happy birthday. But of course, by some luck, Gabriel is the holiest name in the Quran, the Archangel Gabriel. And the shock in this room, because they're like, all these men started crying. And the Taliban lost face. And these Hamas gunmen were like, fuck, because they've just seen a Westerner, a non-believer, who they say we're weak, we're corrupted, prepared to die, not to give up his son's name. Plus, I've called my son the most holy name in Islam.
Yeah.
Now, that transformed everything. The Taliban literally left because they'd lost that, didn't know what to do. But the family at that point, who'd hated me and threw the food, they didn't want to be near me because I was they felt dirty they felt I was dirty, so they didn't even like to be physically near me. After witnessing that moment and me crying, I still get emotional about it, they protected me. They offered me tribal protection, and it was actually a standoff between the Taliban. And anyway, so that was a microcosm where we saw this where they were able to see me as a fellow human being, and everything they'd been drummed into them in the madrasas. We talk about fundamentalists. That just went because the overwhelming humanity. Now, the sad thing with our modern media, it looks like we're seeing and hearing and listening to people all the time, but nothing compares to that human face-to-face contact. And in that moment, we were now brothers and fellow humans, and it was and unfortunately we can't recreate that. We're losing some of that, but anyway, yeah.
What I also I want to ask you a few questions about being held by the Taliban. Like, I also in one of your interviews, I heard you say that they let you go, and then they said, well, unfortunately, or we're not gonna let your
Fixer,
translator, your
translator.
fixer go.
Yeah.
And you and to them you said, well, okay, I'm not leaving without him. I'm curious, like, walk me through that. Why did you do that?
I wouldn't false bravado. I'll tell you what happened.
For 3 months, and
because we were together in a cell for 4 months. In journalists we use the term fixer, but it sounds a bit droll. But he's more than a translator. He was my guide during my captivity. My only way of communicating, translating. But he was like my TV producer. We'd worked together for many years. But there'd been a whole number of incidents where, previous to our kidnap, Western journalists had been kidnapped. They were released, exchanged for money, ransom, but their Afghan fixer was killed. And in fact, the year before, a good friend of my fixer and mine, an Afghan, he was kidnapped with an Italian journalist. The Taliban released them in exchange for a ransom, probably, and they killed the Afghan. So when we were kidnapped, it was really preying on my fixer's mind that Sean, my TV company would get me out, but leave him. And
did he mention this to you?
Did he
say,
we talked about it. It was in fact, the Taliban talked about it as well when they one day, they had this bizarre formality. They don't like to see themselves as terrorists. They have their own rules, and so they came in and formally accused me of being a spy for foreign governments and my fixer, and then walked out the room. And my fixer said, I went, fuck, we've been kidnapped. It was official. And he said, well, we're dead. They kill spies. So, but the Taliban guy, the commander, before he left the room, he said, look, we're going to investigate you. And he had this kind of charisma of a sociopath. He was very charming, but he said, look, don't worry about it. You'll either both be killed or you'll both live. So, don't worry about it. And he was referring to this previous case where a Taliban had kidnapped an Italian journalist and let him go, but killed the Afghan. But so he referred to that. So we discussed it straight away. And so I made a promise. I vowed that we would either both live or both die, that I wouldn't walk out of there without him. I said that to my fixer. Now, at the time, I don't know how truthful that was. I needed to say that because he was keeping me alive. Unless he could translate and communicate, I couldn't get better food. I was trying to talk our way out of there, or talk our way to get a phone call, and I managed to get a few things, and I needed him. So at the time, I wasn't. We made many promises to ourselves, but I didn't know how strong that vow was. But then when we were released, the Taliban came in and again formally read out the judgment of the court. It was like this bizarre court hearing. We're all on the ground. I now look like Robinson Crusoe. I got a long beard. I've lost a lot of teeth. And the commander had this scroll, and he reads out the Taliban Shura, the leading council, said they found that I am innocent, that I am a journalist. I went, whew, nice one. But the Shura, the governing council, would vote to kill me, to send a message to other journalists not to try doing what I do. I was like, oh, fuck, I thought I was, So 1 minute they're saying you're innocent, then I'm like, oh, no. And then he had great time. He said, but don't worry, me and the leader, who's now head of the Taliban, we vetoed the ruling and we've elected to let you go free. So I was like, oh, dude. So I told her I was innocent, but we're going to kill you.
Oh,
then they turned to my fixer and said, you're guilty. So I knew that meant he's dead. And they separated us. I was put into a burqa, a woman's, the covering for women.
Yeah.
Got into a car, put on the side of a road whilst they changed cars, and we were driven into Pakistan to be exchanged. And I remember wearing a burqa. I'd never obviously worn one. The filament where the eyes, this I never realized for women, not only is it purdah, they're imprisoned and cut off from the world, but you can't actually see out properly. You have to squint. So it's the hellish. But I remember squinting and seeing a bunch of men on the side of the road waiting for my car, second car. The Taliban were changing cars. I saw about 20 Arab fighters coming, and I was like, God, what's the life expectancy if they find out there's a white male dressed as a woman on the side of a road? And I started laughing at the ridiculousness. But anyway, being in a burqa, none of these guys looked at me or even talked to me. When I get to the Peshawar in Pakistan, take the burqa off, the Taliban are on the phone to some Western hostage negotiator, and they were obviously agreeing the release. And I knew, I was wondering where, I knew my fixer was somewhere else. They separated us, but I don't know what happened. It just came over me, and I said, look, to the time, I'm not going unless you release my fixer. It's two, and they're looking at me like, no, only one. And they said, forget your fixer. He's fuck him. And I remember turning away, praying, and I said to God, please give me the strength, because I had about 10 seconds, because after 4 months in captivity in a dark cell, every sinew in your body wants to be released, and I've got 2 children, and I knew I couldn't keep this up, but I just went, no, I'm not going, you'll have to kill me. And they were like, in the release, it's very dangerous for both sides, and they didn't want to fuck it up, so they're looking at me like, oh my God, this guy's a lunatic. So they went, okay, we've got both packages, they called us. They were talking to my American hostage negotiator, so they agreed to release both of us. But if they called my bluff, maybe 30 seconds later I would have left him behind, but I didn't.
It's so crazy to me that there are two scenarios that you outline. One, you not budging and saying I can't tell you my kids' names, and then also just that, like, you're you not backing down to let your translator fix her free. It's so crazy that like that kind of attitude was what allowed you to reach freedom and also share humanity with them. Like it's so perplexing
No,
that
but
like that.
funny enough, I think the two are
Yeah.
different. The not refusing to be released without my fixer was a moment of bravado. It was courage. I mean, but it was a real conscious. I had to really struggle to overcome my fear and desire to be released. So it's a conscious struggle, and I'm glad to say. I mean, here's the fact: I wouldn't have been able to live with myself.
Yeah.
If my poor fixer now, if I'd left him behind, he was dead. So, but I had that strength left to do it. But it was a conscious thing. Ironic, the thing with my children, I had no part in that. It was not a conscious decision. I remember at the time I was with the AK-47 to my head, completely kind of that beatific, blissful state of calm when you know you're dead. You've resigned yourself to death. I was actually full of this is this kind of weird secret all hostages have. You have a spiritual experience when you're kidnapped because you know you're going to die. You have this overwhelming sense of love for all living things in life, and I've never felt so connected to my loved ones as when I was cut off in that dark cell. But that was a different thing that I just wasn't able to give my children, and I laughed at the time because I was aware, like you can shoot your, and I actually said, I'm sorry, you'll have to shoot me. I just was not able to because that was out. It was an out of body experience. Those were the light. There was the light, the candlelight in that dark room with my young innocent children, and I couldn't bring there. And of course, I did to save Sammy. When they put it when they threatened to kill my fixer. Yeah, but I
What was
yeah.
yeah. What was life? I mean, how did your life change when you got back to the UK after that?
Well, so here's the wisdom you asked about.
Yes.
Okay, it's not a good. It's not. It's like the movie when they're on the yellow brick road, and they get to the end of it, and the wizard is just a little guy behind a curtain.
Yeah.
Whilst I was kidnapped, the experience was unbelievable. In the sense that now there's different explanations for it. It's the scientists would say when the brain, knowing the body it's in, is facing existential threat, a clear present. So it's like if the body is going through it in a car crash, the lower part of the brain, the amygdala, literally switches off the frontal cortex and kicks in, and your instincts. So the moment I was kidnapped and they threatened to kill me, I had total recall over my entire life. I could see myself age 5, my first day in kindergarten. I could name the teachers because that's the psychologists, scientists that told me later. That's your brain thinking, we don't know what this guy needs to survive, but we've given him everything we've got.
Wow.
I was so pumped of adrenaline, cortisol. I had teeth falling out through my mouth. Didn't feel any pain. I was doing 100 press ups a day. When I got out, I had all my glands around my body swollen, but the body's like this superhuman strength. But it also, I felt like Scrooge on Christmas Eve, where you're the ghost of Christmas past. I saw my whole life very clearly what I'd done wrong. Now, something else happened. I was listening to the radio about, it was a story about Somalia, war-torn country where this woman was talking about her husband had gone to get bread for their children, had been killed at a checkpoint. And she's talking about her suffering. Now, this suffering was something is happening all over the world, happening now in Gaza and Ukraine. People are being killed. Now, first in my life, I started crying when I heard her story on the radio because I could feel her pain. And for the first time in my life, because I know what it's like to live in fear of the knock on the door, that opened me up to the suffering in the world. Now, it's an amazing gift because we all have it. empathy. And what we do is we turn our back on it and we shut. But when you're open to it, I could literally feel this woman's pain, and I started crying. But I could also feel people's joy. I was aware when I used to every night at the time. I knew it'd be bath time in London for my children. They were very young, so I used to bathe them at 5 p.m. Well, I knew that time I would close my eyes in my cell, kneel down by the bed, and bathe my children, and I could feel their skin beneath my fingers. I could hear them cry with joy and laughter. I could feel you're basically open. You're connected to the other people's suffering, joys. And I thought, my God, if by some miracle I survive this, I'm not going to put this to waste. I'm going to come out. I'm going to put the lessons I've learned that I have to be a good protector and provider to my children. But the only way to do that is to protect and provide for the earth. So, it's no good if the garden's poisoned. So that's part of being a protector provider. But also the social injustice. Once you've heard the woman's pain and crying and you feel that pain, you can't turn your back. So anyway, that's the lesson I learned. 2 weeks after my release, I'm on TV. I'm a bit of a celebrity, a kidnapped hostage celebrity. Suddenly, women were coming up to me in bars. I'm in a nightclub. I was drinking strawberry daiquiri, and this woman gave me a line of cocaine. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is great. And I'm like thinking, fuck, I don't think that was the point of that lesson. So the tragedy is, and I remember, a week later thinking my life would be better if I had a Porsche. That maybe you can't live at that intensity, but these lessons we learn are quickly forgotten. I'm still imbued with. Occasionally, I catch myself going, God, life, the fragility and exquisite joy of life, is still. I've never lost that. But I forgot a lot of the lessons I learned, and that's the nature of human beings, I think.
Yeah. Anything else? I mean, technically, the video that you sent me about the hostages and Jim Foley, I watched the clip that you sent me, but that wasn't made by you, but you were featured in it, and
that was a story I couldn't make. I was in because I was going to make a documentary, but it was a bit too close to home, and so I interviewed the terrorists who kidnapped the 23 Westerners, and they're from London. So that was weird. You talk about, when you talk about Islamic extremism, I went to Syria. They'd been captured by the Kurdish, were being held.
Oh, wow.
But I'm meeting 2 Londoners,
Yeah.
And it was a strange warmth. Well, not warmth, but a kind of, you're meeting fellow Londoners. It's like being in the middle of nowhere, far away country, and you're meeting someone from Brooklyn.
Yeah,
There's an immediate warmth. And swapping like, oh, what part of London? And I'd been told, whatever you do, don't make it personal. They hadn't confessed to being the beat. Well, they vaguely at that point admitted, but said they had nothing to do with the kidnap, and especially nothing to do with the murder of any of the hostages. And I went there as a journalist, but obviously hoping against hope they might say something to incriminate themselves. But I was told by all my journalist friends, whatever you do, don't make it personal. Don't let them know you're a friend of Jim Foley's. But it was the least professional. It's all filmed, and it was in that it's a Danish documentary called The Hostage Takers. They showed clips, but it was like, okay, so I walk in, and couldn't help myself. I sit down, shake the hand of one of these guys, who I'd read all the reports, including FBI reports, how he'd personally tortured 23 people, including my friend Jim. I shake his hand, and I said, look, I might as well tell you this now. It was a bit like not being able to tell my name to children. This is just something overcame me. And I said, look, I might as well say this now. Your good friend, Muhammad and Wazi, Jihadi John, he was called, he beheaded my good friend James Foley, and we're shaking hands. And the strangest thing happened. This guy, it wasn't remorse. He inflicted so much trauma on other people. He's carrying that trauma with him. I could feel it come through his arm that I know I'm shaking the hand of the man who I knew a lot of instances what he'd done, choke holding Jim till he passed out, and this strange sensation is coming. He didn't want to shake my hand, but I wouldn't let it go. And it's a strange thing with trauma. Those who inflicted pain on others, he was off burdening, so he confessed to me. Now the other guy, I'd interview them separately. He went the other way. It became very aggressive, and we ended up almost having a fight. So one I'm sort of, he's shedding tears and we're kind of embracing, and the other one we're getting into a fight. But yeah, so I couldn't really make that film, but that interview I did there, it was over like 3 days, 25 hours, and they confessed, and actually ended up in court in America. And my interview was shown in court. They're now in jail in America.
What a surreal experience.
And that was, I kind of felt the end for me in covering those wars in the Middle East. For personal reasons, I was, having been kidnapped away from my children.
Yeah.
It left a little cast a shadow over their lives, and they were very young but aware that Daddy may, you grow up, children have fairy tales of the bogeyman, or don't go into the woods at night, but then my children are like, suddenly, this is real, these horrors are real in the world. So I was very careful in the years after my kidnapping, taking them on these great adventures, bonding time. Now, funny enough, when I was kidnapped, to escape captivity, I would take trips with my children, because and it was no good saying one day I'll take them to Disneyland, because that would only escape from your cell for 10 seconds. So I would have these real time trips where I would lie in my bed and think, right, where am I going to take my children today? I'll take them to Florida, Disney. So what airline am I getting on at Heathrow? What movies are we watching? Now, what you're doing is you spend 2 hours and you've escaped your captivity, and then you'll be brought back to it. And then when I was released, I took my kids on these real trips. One of them was Iceland. I'd seen that movie with Ben Stiller where he goes to Iceland.
Oh, yeah.
I love that film.
Walter Mitty, is that it?
Okay, it's I love that movie.
Yeah.
Well, so when I'm in captivity, I'm thinking I'm going to take my children to do the same trip. And when I got released, I take them to Iceland, and it's the most magical place in the world. Feels otherworldly, but in fact, it's the most raw part of the planet. You're sitting on a volcano, and well, that's when we were camping, and I hear the news that my friend James Foley has been beheaded. And my then 7-year-old says to me, "Dad, that could have been you," but he said it not like you say it to a friend. That could have been you. You're lucky. He said it accusing me. That's what the pain you would have caused us. And at that point, I vowed, okay, it's enough of that.
Yeah.
So I haven't been back to the Middle East, and I stopped taking so many risks. But this war in Ukraine, after 10, 15 years of not doing this kind of wars, I really felt, I feel to do the sort of stuff I'm doing, i.e. putting your life at risk, and it's not your life, it's potentially creating a lifetime of suffering for those you love. And that's quite a selfish thing. So I feel now I can only really do what I do if I feel there's a real need to tell this story. So much storytelling nowadays that's meaningless. It's mainly about selling shit. But I kind of feel I'm looking at that war. It's the most one-sided coverage, but it's potentially existential. Both President Biden and Putin, one thing they agreed on is we're now living in the most dangerous time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's this big war happening in the heart of Europe, nuclear power involved, NATO's supporting one side. And I felt this is a story worth devoting time. And so I went out, and I kind of feel that if there's anything, you don't change the world, but you don't stop trying. And if you can convince one or two people, that's why I like, ask you about the podcast. I come across things where I don't care if it's 1 million listeners or viewers, but if there's something nice and one person is touched by what you say or thinks about something, I think it's worth it. But I felt that film or my trip was worth doing to understand their perspective and how we've got into this. And, so yeah. I can't remember what the question was. I do that. I go off piste.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, it's all good, man. I like it. I mean, I had an idea of where I was gonna go, and now I'm like, okay, we're going somewhere. We're skirting. We're going somewhere else. So that brings up when I watched Mission Accomplished and The Other Side. One of the most interesting one of the really interesting thing that you do is you spend a lot of time with soldiers and you ask them. You're kind of just shooting the shit with them, asking them about their lives. How do they make sense of kind of their reality? And in both films, there was very much like kind of an ambiguous justification. A lot of them were telling you different things for why they were there, and none of it really was very compelling.
No.
And then the second kind of emotion behind that was they accepted their reality as a soldier, like as a job. So there's like a lack of conviction, but they like assume it and they commit to it. And I just found it so fascinating. I mean, to me, that was incredibly humanizing because it's like people are put in these situations for whatever reason and feel, I guess, the need or feel stuck or for whatever justification lives inside of their mind to be a soldier.
Well,
and it was just, it was a lot less like, we're fighting for freedom, and it's just like, this is kind of what this is my 100%. Job. This is what I do.
Yeah. And you know what? To me, it was revelatory because going back to people online. So in Vietnam, American soldiers had this great acronym, REMFs, Rear Echelon Motherfuckers. So the people in DC running that war were the rear echelon motherfuckers because the young grunts are out there. And so in DC, Nixon or wherever, they got the reasons for war. The protesters were getting very angry, but they were also rear echelon motherfuckers in a way back home. So because those protesting against the war or American soldiers in Vietnam, well, they're not there as representatives of the war machine. They're just young Americans in Vietnam. So I had this one. Now, again, as you say, I'm not a news journalist, and I've realized anyway that when you ask people the news style questions, you get nothing. You don't learn anything. If you say to a Muslim terrorist, "Why are you fighting?" he will quote Islam or Al Qaeda. You ask the Russian soldier, "Why are you fighting?" he quotes the propaganda. We're fighting Nazis. American soldiers, we're fighting freedom. None of them believe any of that shit because you go to the front line, and the closer you are to the front line, the more truth you get. So one day I'm up a mountain in Afghanistan, in Kunar province, one of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan. Young American soldiers were up there for 6 months without rotation, suffering from scurvy. I mean, they had no fresh food. They were having to get vitamins, as you say. Now, I'm sitting there with these young kids, black, white, Hispanic. It was this great mix. That's the great thing about the army as well. It's a lot more mixed than a lot of areas back home or industries. Like the liberal media is not as ethnically mixed as the army. So in that sense, it's more liberal. I'm up there, and it is so dangerous up there. We were laughing at the insanity of it, and I'm like, how did you guys end up here? Why did you join? And it was so funny. It just so happened, for some reason, this unit, the reason why they joined the army and and gone to fight for freedom and democracy, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Afghan. Well, the reason why they went, they'd all been in prison, so they'd all been done local jails for like minor, and so they were around the campfire. One guy said, "Well, he'd done 2 times for some minor crimes." The judge said, you either now go to federal prison or you join the army. He was like, okay, I'm joining the army. So it turned out all these kids had been carjacking or some little crime, had done 2 times in local jail, and they're judged 3rd time, you go, you fight for freedom and democracy, or you go to federal prison. One of the kids around the campfire went, well, no, mine's different. And we were laughing because all these guys who'd been in jail were now heroes. And they were genuine heroes, but they were laughing at the insanity of the world because one of them had read they were all online when they were back in some base in Jalalabad. He'd literally walked through the valley of death to help a fellow soldier who'd been shot in the head and got wounded himself. And he was now being heralded as this hero back home. And he was like laughing because he knew, it's like, well, back home, I'm considered fucking the scum. You know, I was a prisoner. I was a car thief and a drug dealer. Now I'm a hero. It's madness, but I'm still the same. And they had, what kept them going was the love of each other, the humanity, the bond. But one of the kids around the campfire, he hadn't been in jail. His was, no, well, he's from Florida. Never forget these guys. He said, I was in Miami. He worked in a nightclub doing the valet parking. Now, he was a really good-looking 20-year-old. He said it was great. He was on rollerblades a lot of the time. He said he'd park the cars, and he was just like, women leaving this nightclub in their Ferraris, he would hand them the car, and they would give him a tip. He was making like $5,000 a week, but he'd also get phone numbers saying, if you want to come back to mine. And literally, the rest of the platoon are sitting there going, you gave up that shit to come here? He went, and it was, we were laughing so much, and they said, don't put that on camera. Hilarious. But it was one of those beautiful moments. And so none of us had, so we were all they were the tip of the spear. They were representing America, defending or fighting for freedom and democracy. But no, that's not how they ended up. But it was a lovely tale there because they were true heroes. And there was this lovely, and it was this lovely color blindness because, you know, if someone's, I've been giving CPR to a dying body, human, and if you open a chest, you know, it doesn't matter what race, gender, it's exactly the same. And I remember once, and this is a bit intense, but you know, you see inside someone's chest and the blood, and you know. So that one, there was the sadly with war, but it does reveal this the humanity and it was all. I spent most of my time out there laughing. Now, what's funny about doctors say the same as surgeons have gallows humor. You know, in the war zone, you spend most of your time laughing because any moment someone's going to die. You come back and you're like, oh, you mustn't lie. That's insane. It's shocking. People are suffering in Gaza, but I know in Gaza now, the medics and the Palestinian camera crews and journalists, there's going to be a lot of laughter and joy because they're all hypersensitive and aware that any moment death will be there. So, strange times.
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, like the reality of the human experience is like infinitely complicated.
But at the same time, though, we get clouded and complicated back home. So because one of the things we're assaulted by our sensory overload from going through our phones and social media and TV, and it's overload. But again, what I love about that, there's a clarity in the front lines. You sit in a trench. Yeah. There's a clarity moments before I was told I was going to be executed, and life then is, I can't tell you, and everyone will say this who's ever been in these situations, which unfortunately is millions of people, you know, now in Gaza. Life is incredibly simple.
I guess what I'm alluding to is like there's this deep irony. The complexity of the world is that there's this deep irony when you're abroad fighting a war and you're about to, you're in proximity of dying. You have all these people, you know, there's a really good film called Restrepo by Sebastian Junger, and basically like
and my friend Tim.
of that.
So
okay,
it's funny you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Just a few days ago, a friend of mine who works for Human Rights Watch in New York, Emma Daly, comes to London. We were good friends with Tim Hetherington, who made the film with Sebastian. Well, that's where that, by the way, Restrepo, that was Kunar. That's where I was on that base. The
Okay.
COP, I was there before them. In fact, an American journalist, Elizabeth Rubin, who was the first amongst us. So you talk about this macho male. There was a woman up there, Liz Rubin, who told me, you got to go up there. It's the most dangerous place in Afghanistan. I then told Tim, and he made that film, but Restrepo's good. I love it.
Yeah.
But I was just at the Imperial War Museum, and they've got an exhibition of Tim's photographs.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
There's the Bronx Documentary Center in New York, and they have a bunch of his work as well.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
What is that in the Bronx? He's the guy who runs that, is it?
I forget the name of the person that runs it, but they have a bunch of his like equipment and like photos and some of his books and.
Well, he was photographing it. It's a different platoon, but you see the same young Americans up in those mountains, surrounded by death.
To finish the point, it's that documentary is amazing, and also that the documentary, like, where is the front line from here, that covers Tim Hetherington's life. They spend a lot of time talking about his experience there, but it is really ironic that there's so much love and friendship in these incredibly dark and precarious circumstances, and then simultaneously you have in certain aspects of the Western world, exuberant wealth, so much security, so much safety, and then you have depression and eating disorders and hate, and the complexity of the universe. It works in mysterious ways.
Well, now, I mean, I don't know how long we've been talking about this. We're now getting to the meat of it. You asked about wisdom, and this stuff. I'm glad you can't see my face, so stuff I wouldn't admit to. I would come back. I lived in a very nice part of London called Notting Hill at the time.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
And it's like a world famous, very wealthy, cool place. I'd come back from Afghanistan, Iraq, and literally, in today's world, you get on a plane, you go. I mean, I'd be in Iraq, but you have to step over headless corpses on the road. It was that kind of place.
Oh my gosh!
Be back in Portobello Road 48 hours later in Notting Hill, where these rich people be air kissing. Or I remember coming home from Afghanistan, where most of my friends there, Afghans, have lost a family member through dysentery or child, let alone violence. I would come back and feel very soon this coldness in the West, this lack of human warmth, and I would miss Afghanistan and a place like Iraq. And what I was missing was that warmth, the family, being surrounded by, you're growing up in poverty in Afghanistan, but the children are growing up in a compound with an auntie, that family unit, but the warmth. And I'd be back in London, where London's worse than New York. The neighbours don't talk to each other. They can live next to someone for 10 years without saying anything. And people will be depressed. But they have literally Mercedes and a house worth 20 million, whatever.
Yeah.
I found that over the years, my feeling on that is twofold. It goes back to what I was telling you when I was in my cell, listening to BBC about, and a woman talking about how her husband had been killed in Somalia, buying bread for the children. And he had to cross 3 checkpoints. Very dangerous, but they were hungry. And I could, as she told her story, I started crying. I felt this depression in the West, it's an industry where we spend billions going to therapy, spa treatments, whatever it is. I've got this feeling that it's because we're turning our back on suffering. But what I discovered, so I cried when I was in my cell because I could feel her pain. Now in London, it's like being on cocaine. It anesthetizes you. We're cut off. We can turn our back on sorry, it's a helicopter.
That's okay.
I feel like I'm back in Nam. I've noticed in the West, you can turn off the TV and you can turn your back on the suffering happening now in Gaza. But I subconsciously, subliminally, as humans, we're empathetic social creatures. We're actually can't turn our back on that suffering. We can tune it out, but it was just more acute. So my kidnap opened me up, made me more. It didn't make me more empathetic. It kind of cleared the channels. But I think as humans, as sympathetic, empathetic social creatures, we turn our back on the world's suffering and justice. But that's the kind of seeping in, making us depressed. And there's this life we have where we're wasting things or we're not spending time with our children. Therein lies our depression. And so that's the thing. I actually bizarrely came back from those places of suffering and violence to peace and safety in the West, but I would feel cold and cut off here because that lack of human contact, so there's that bizarre mixture. And also living intently, living, one of the things I had, which is hard in the West, is there was a quote by Winston Churchill: "You never feel quite so alive as when you hear the crack of a bullet by your ear." Now, there's a danger in that, but living that life intently, I lived 20 lifetimes in terms of experience. So yeah.
But tell me, I mean, you've talked about James Foley quite a bit. Maybe tell me how you met him, and kind of, I'm also just interested in the life of a war documentarian, but like how did you meet him? And
well, it's slightly, I don't know why I'm talking about him today more than funny enough,
I watched a documentary about him, and it's amazing. I mean, his story is incredibly sad, but worth
well, one thing I tell the families, and I've dealt with a lot of hostage families, they suffer far worse than hostages, because the suffering of not knowing is far worse than actually when you're in an experience, because you're always imagining the worst. So for a mother, the kidnap is worse for the mother than the hostage. And what I had a strange experience actually on that question you asked about Jim. I'd never met Jim's mother, Diane Foley, who's an amazing woman who runs the James Foley Foundation, campaigning for hostages today. I'd never met her, but I was aware from my own mother the suffering I was putting my loved ones through. And I remember when I was kidnapped, having this renewed appreciation for life, because mine, I thought, was about to end. I was actually overwhelmed by love. It was so powerful, because I had memories of my childhood holidays, my brothers and sisters playing as kids. I could see my holidays. So in fact, my experience as a hostage was one of overwhelming love. So when I get out, I'm aware, when I'm doing these other stories, and my friend Jim, I was making a documentary. There's 23 hostages, a lot of families, and I talked to a lot of them. I knew that my experience was overwhelming love. And I remember at the time, I wrote to my diary during my captivity, if by some chance my family find this diary, I want them to know I don't want my family and loved ones to spend I don't want my death to cast a shadow over the rest of their lives. And the irony is, what they don't know is I'm so happy because I've lived a blessed life, and I'm aware how beautiful the world is. I would like them. I never needed to tell my family that, because I was able to meet my children. So I write a letter to Diane Foley, and I said to her, now, it's very dangerous when you're playing with other people's lives and loss. You don't want to give them false hope or say something cheap and glib. But I kind of thought, hey, Jim's my buddy. He's going to let me try and make the mother feel better, even if I might not be 100% correct. But I wrote this letter to Diane saying, look, I know Jim would want me to tell you this, but he was happy and filled with love. And because I knew I was, and I was talking to my friend, and even if I was wrong, he wouldn't mind me saying it to make his family feel good. Well, Diane emailed me back and said, wow. And she was really moved by this letter. And she goes, but more than moved, Jim had written a letter that another hostage had taken out because he was beheaded. But this other European hostage, now the letter was verbatim, very similar to what I wrote. And Jim had written this last letter to his family saying, I am full of love, overwhelmed by love. I remember childhood, hanging out with my brother, and those memories are so wonderful. And he had this light love. So, okay, so then she was crying, and it's like, wow. And I was like, fuck, it's like, I got it right. Jim did want me to say that. And then she said, look, do you mind if I share your letter with this other mother who of a hostage of Kayla Muller, a young girl? And I said, oh God, because my letter was saying, look, don't get it wrong. The hostages, your daughter or son, are full of love. They were happy. So please. But I thought, oh no, well, Jim was my friend. And he wouldn't mind me, even if, because I was saying, look, trust me, Jim was full of love. I thought, well, I felt maybe this young female hostage wasn't. And so I said, look, I just want to share with the mother, who I didn't know, and I didn't know Kayla. Well, the mother of Kayla, Marsha Muller, it was the strangest thing. I would love one day to be able to share these letters. Emailed me saying, in tears, saying, it was like Kayla was talking to me when I read your letter to Diane.
Wow.
And then she let me read the letter, which was Kayla's last letter, because some Yazidi prisoner girls took her letter and got it out. And the letter is, Mother, I am the light in this darkness. I'm overwhelmed by the light and love for my family, my friends. So I am so full of love. This is an amazing moment. Please don't suffer. And it was the same words I'd used practically. And I said that I'd written to my mum when I thought I was going to be killed. Well, turns out all the hostages, those who could, had written letters, were the same letters I'd written. I never had to give to my mum, but the same letter James wrote, that Kayla Muller wrote, that when you know life's going to die and you're going to die, you're overwhelmed by this appreciation of life. And to me, it was so deeply, that's a universal human thing. And it's the fact that our letters were almost verbatim, similar, talking about childhood memories. I mean, there's beautiful light in the world, and that stayed with me. Now, that light, if it can survive in the darkness of a cell when you're being tortured and raped, cannot be extinguished. And it's the light in all of us. So it was a wonderful, overwhelming thing. So whenever I look around at the world and the hatred, we go back to some of those stories I was talking earlier about the culture wars, or when I was looking at these young feminists arguing with the trans, all I saw was the light of these lovely young women who in the West, educated, arguing their case. So, that candle never goes out.
That's amazing. How did you meet James Foley?
So this is the West for you. Before legacy media companies send you to war zones, they send you on a hostile environment course in a nice hotel somewhere in England or America. And that's not because they care about us, it's insurance. They don't want to get sued. So it's basically an insurance thing. So I was on a hostile environment course in the English countryside. It's a 3-day course where you learn about how to put a trauma kit on, and if you get your leg blown off, and they're useful. They're good courses, and you can save a life. Tim died in Libya. Tim Hetherington mentioned, and so you're learning how to tie a tourniquet can save a life. But I'm at the back of the class, and this ex-British soldier's giving the class. And he's showing clips. And he's got this British soldier. He's going, "What? Look at this fucking idiot! Look at this idiot! This is what you don't do in a war zone." And I'm looking at the clip. I'm like, "Oh my god, that's one of my documentaries." Talk about fame. I'm 3 clips. He's using an example of, look at this idiot. This is what you don't do in a war zone. And I'm sitting there. And I'm like, "Fucking hell, that's me." And I'm keeping my head down. And there's a guy sitting next to me who says, "Hey, dude, is that you?" And it's Jim Foley. Anyway, cut long story short, so we met on a hostile environment course, and he was at that time working for Stars and Stripes. He was a young freelance journalist, and he was about to go to Afghanistan, but Stars and Stripes were only giving him like $100. I said, that won't get you back to London, so why don't you stay at mine? And I tell you what, we had an amazing thing about life as well, and I love about the people in my world community is, I was a bit jaded at that point because I'd been kidnapped and I'd lost that innocence, that love of the world and life. And I was and also the irony, and I had PTSD, not because of the experience so much, but when I got back, I was no longer allowed to go to war zones, and all my TV broadcasters, I couldn't get insurance, so that felt like punishment. Not only I had been captured and tortured, I was now not able to do what I love, the vocation, making documentaries. And I met Jim at that point in my life, but he was full of the beginning of wanting to go out in the world and explore and adventures, and he reinvigorated me. And we drank red wine, we watched documentaries, we watched films, we talked about traveling the world, going to these, it was like people throughout history traveling beyond their horizons to open the mind. And as all young people are doing great. It's one of the loveliest things, gap years, whatever. And so he reinvigorated, and he went off, and I saw him briefly again because he got kicked out of Afghanistan, but then he went to Libya, and then went to Syria, and was captured, kidnapped, and killed. Yeah. So we met on a hostile environment course, and he said, and he asked me to be his mentor, and I said, "Fuck it,"
wow.
and I said, "Listen, I'm such a fucker. I get kidnapped. You need me as a mentor, you're in trouble." Anyway, yeah, that's how we
Amazing.
met.
How did you meet Tim Hetherington?
Well, as I was saying, it's a small traveling band of misfits, and Tim, we're all in Afghanistan. You meet in weird bars and places, on the back of a truck or train. But I think I met Tim in a number of places. But then I remember, here's the thing about life. Those photographs in that film with Streppos, they've captured something amazing there. It's like a touching life, the essence of this moment.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I love filmmaking is a famous French photographer, Cartier-Bresson, who talked about what he felt photography was capturing that moment. And they do that in that film. Stuff is just happening around you, and that's what I love documentaries. It's when I'm in a situation, and you only get it by people around you they're no longer noticing you. You're not a TV person. You're just this fly on the wall. But something happens in front of the camera, and it's just like, wow, you've captured something. It's a moment. Tim was great at doing that. But here's the thing: I met him at we were at some talk. We were giving a talk together at some film festival, and he gets a phone call. Now he was talking about getting married, work's going well. He gets a call saying Restrepo's up for an Oscar, and he puts the phone down, and he's like, wow. And we're sharing this moment, like, life's good. He's got his work's been recognized. He's in love. He's getting married. Well, he goes to Libya and dies. And that was the last time I met him. And, I thought about this. I was looking at his exhibition, those photographs up in Africa, and some of the moments I've had, if I didn't have kids, if it's only my life, I have no regrets. The only regret I had when I was kidnapped was the suffering I would inflict on my children. But the life we lead is, I think one has to always take care. I always advise young foreign correspondents or war filmmakers or journalists going into those conflict zones. There's no pride. A lot of people, not a lot, but you meet the young ones or older guys as well, thinking just take risks. They're adrenaline junkies. Well, they don't last long, those people. But I'm not promoting the risk taking I've done in the past, but the life, the things I've experienced and lived, when they're so. I've had moments in life where in 10 seconds you experience a lifetime. I was in a battle. I was with British soldiers surrounded by there was 20 British soldiers surrounded by 500,000 Taliban, and the British intelligence had got it wrong. They thought there were 50 Taliban, so they literally were sent off on it's like the First World War. They said, "Be over by Christmas." They said, "We'll see you tomorrow for tea." There's some British general. And a week later, they were surrounded and cut off. But I remember every second there where RPGs and landing around you and bullets just slamming around you. Just every second felt like a lifetime.
Wow.
And I look back on it, though, and it felt like I'd lived that life. And I'm still in contact with that unit, who all hate me when I turn up because I'm this liberal media twat. And at the end, we were brothers, you know?
Yeah. That's wow. Amazing how that happens. How do you when you're thinking about creating a film, like what's that process like? Like how do you come about these ideas, and then how do you kind of
Yeah.
start to execute them?
Well, yeah, so goes back to my first ever documentary in Kashmir, where I told you where I was there as a professional journalist doing a story, i.e., I've got a commission, got no emotional involvement.
Yeah.
It was printing, but we're part of the media machine. Now, what switched there was when, you know, and I told you I was emotionally, my girlfriend had left me, but that emotion is quite good. If you're trying to tell human stories, to be a bit emotional and raw, this is the most, you won't read this in any guidebook or college about journalism, but I think it was pivotal in my career. Also, when I got to know the families who were there trying to look for their loved ones who've been kidnapped, when that guy came into the hotel saying, I can put you in contact with the kidnapper, it stopped being a job for me. I said to the families, yeah, I got nothing to do. I've been dumped by my guy. I will meet this guy and try and get to the kidnappers to help your kids. Well, so that made for great journalism because I'm not there now thinking about deadlines, thinking about my career. I'm trying to find out what happened to hostages. And I was very aware at the end of that, you'll never go wrong as a filmmaker, novelist, writer, if you do this. If you pick a story you're genuinely in love with, if you find something you're in love with, and then a story, and you follow it till the end, you'll never go wrong. Now, the problem with that is you won't have a career because those don't come along that often. And the pressures in this modern age is you can't keep going. You got to, you know, you'll see documentaries that look like they've spent an age in a life with people, but they're there for 3 weeks in and out, and they're filming. Yeah. Well, you can smell those. I can see those. I can watch them, and I know it's fake. But I've made compromises, and I've made a lot of bad documentaries, and that's when I was doing stories I didn't really feel a connection to, or I compromised on time. But, you know, you've got to lead a life. So I would do this. What I do is, and I'm glad I'm not a news journalist, or I don't have I'm not rich because I don't make many films, but it gives me a great advantage if you're not part of that news 24 cycle. They got to pump shit out every day. 3 stories a day, 5 stories a day.
Yeah.
Well, clearly the quality is going to suffer.
Yeah.
The knowledge, the understanding, the depth, everything. So I was watching, to give an example how I pick stories, I'm looking at the invasion of Ukraine, watching it on TV, saturated news coverage for 6 months, and slowly I'm like, I'm only seeing one side here, you know. So I'm slowly that time. So I think being able to sit back and reflect on the world. So I read books, read news, but I'm not. I then have to switch off because the trouble is we're being inundated with information, data. That's a useful process, but then you need to go and sit in your reflect and let that sink into this beneath. So you need to cut off. Now then, when I pick the story, when I go to like Ukraine, before I go, I read all the good newspapers I like, the in-depth ones. I read a couple of books. But when I'm there, I kind of just immerse myself in the culture and I cut off from the media industry back home. I'm not on the, I never like talk to my bosses on the phone. I'm not popular for that. Because I want to live where I am, and that's doing the story. And I then also think it's very important. So here's the other thing. So I kind of live like a monk when I'm there. I live and breathe the story and with the people. One other thing I've been very careful, if any young, old filmmakers want to pick up a tip, is respect to those you're telling their story. That we're always looking for, it's very easy as a journalist to make someone look bad, to change stuff, if you've got you don't like the Israelis, you don't like Hamas, it's easy to make them look shit on camera or say stupid things. But I feel if these people, especially with the films I make where they're in extremists. They're risking their lives. They could be, a lot of people I'm filming won't be alive the next day. That I owe them a debt of honor. If someone's going to let you tell their story, I want to make sure I reflect them as rounded as possible and their humanity. And one thing I'm glad is I've made documentaries, whether it's Taliban, Americans, British, Ukrainians, Russians. No one's ever individually said, I hate what you've done. You know, that you can be condemning of a government or a state or a terrorist group. But I don't want to cheat the people who've been in my film. So I think that's important.